Tonight's session is going to be race, equity, and cultural responsiveness. What's the difference? I'm Heather Paremba. I'm an educational consultant out of the Patent West office. I am a part of the EL team through Patent, but I'm joined by my colleague and our state lead, Maria Ronenberger, this evening. So Maria, if you want to go ahead and introduce yourself.
Good evening, everyone. It's so good to see everyone here. I am Maria Ronenberger, and as Heather said, I am the state lead for the EL initiative. That's your English Learner Initiative for the state of Pennsylvania. And so I'm very happy to be speaking with all of you tonight.
We're going to start out with a little bit of a video clip here from The Arrival by Sean Tan. So this is a migrant story, and it's told throughout a series of wordless images. We're going to skip ahead a little bit into the book. So what you won't see, what comes at the beginning is a man that's leaving his wife and child, leaving an impoverished town, seeking better prospects in an unknown country. So he, like I said, he leaves his family, he gets on a boat and comes to what may appear to be New York. But we'll go ahead and show you this clip. Let me know if the sound, we probably should have taken a look at that. Let me know if the sound comes through.
Ooh.
So Heather, we're not able to hear the sound. So just so everyone knows, you will not hear speaking, but you should be able to hear some contextual sounds. So we'll try it again.
Heather, you may have to click to enable the sound on your, go to the top control panel.
I know this usually does pop up, but I am not seeing an option to share. Oh, okay. Now I got it. I apologize. All right. So we're just going to back this up a smidge. Sorry about that. Listen up. Okay, and we're going to go ahead and pause it there. I probably should have prompted you or previewed that. I wanted you to just kind of be noticing what was, in the pictures and in the video. So we will come back to that at the end. But for now, if everyone, if we could do a little bit of a chat waterfall here, if you want to put a little something, prep it for what you noticed throughout the video, and any thoughts, any reactions that you might have. And then we'll give you about a minute, and then when we say go, we'll hit enter and we'll see what everybody's responses are. And then Maria and Sherry, once we start doing that, if you could take a peek at at everyone's responses, that would be great. All right, how about everybody go ahead and hit enter? What did you notice or what stood out to you throughout that little bit of a clip from the book?
Okay, so Heather, we have the struggle to find work and communicate, the foreign language throughout the scenes. Everyone had a weird looking pet. Some people were kind to him and some people were not. Minimal color. The man is seeking a job. The language struggle. Shopping. The man looked very sad and alone. And the little creature that was following him.
Yeah, those are all great observations. I think some of what you said stood out to me the first time. This is actually something that Maria had shared with me. And the first time, that I was watching it was just thinking of all of the things that are new to, the language isn't familiar. You can tell there's symbols like somebody had pointed out, the pets, the creatures that exist, are not of something that is familiar to us. And so just thinking about how migrating or immigrating to a new country or to a different country, how things could be very different maybe than we even think, I don't know if there's anything you wanted to add right now, Maria.
Yeah, I would all those things that you noticed are great. Thank you so much for sharing all the way from, what you physically saw or experienced, but then also the structure of the text. The things that are kind of implicit here is that there were no words. So even thinking about when we're talking about literature and the books that we present our students with, picture books. Are they valued or are they not valued? How are they used or not used? So some things that we're going to go into when we're talking about this subject tonight. So I enjoy sharing this book with teachers. And I would like to know, has anyone ever seen this book before in the group? And if you're willing to, you can either unmic or you can share that in the chat. If this is something that you've seen, okay, some yeses and some nos. So Catherine, you've seen this book before. Have you used it yourself as a teacher?
Yes, I actually got a class set of the book through Donors Choose. I teach 5th grade, and we've used it for all kinds of things. Plot, blowing up pictures from the book and placing them around the classroom. And having students go in groups and using sticky notes. What do you notice? What do you wonder? And then having students respond to students' responses, things like that.
Exactly. Oh, Catherine, I can't wait for you to share more as we are going to come full circle in our presentation with this text. And I would love to hear more. And that as educators, there's things that I absolutely agree with how I use the book as well. And so that'll be really great to share as a group. And as we uncover some more things together, as Heather and I share with you, letting this text kind of give us that context and that grounding to think about what we're diving into today. And put your put your hat on of your teacher brains of how can I then use what I've learned today in the classroom with teaching literacy. So awesome. Thank you for sharing.
Yes, thank you very much. I agree. I'm excited to hear more later. Okay, so we're going to kind of put that on hold for now. Like we said, we will revisit this, but just to try to address a little bit of the topics, that were part of tonight's overall topic. So we have the thinking about diversity language, right? So we have words, race, ethnicity, culture, and there could be many definitions, I feel like, for these words. But these are kind of the ones that we have landed on for the purposes of tonight's session and for education. So race, a group of people descended from a common ancestor having distinct physical characteristics. Race is often thought of as skin tone or hair color or texture. There are some that would argue that race is really a social construct, that it's not a reliable indication of genetic variation among people, but that it's something that's used to discriminate against others and leverage power. But for some, race is really an important part of their identity, right? When it comes to ethnicity, belonging to a social group that has a common national or cultural tradition, which is takes into many, many factors. And then the definition from Zion and Kozaleski of culture being a system of shared beliefs, values, customs, behaviors, and artifacts that members of society use to interact. So meaning those that they use to interact with each other and with the world at large. So thinking of culture as a way of life of a group of people. So it's not specific to skin tone or geographic region or language. As with many definitions of these terms, as there can be, there are also many models of what culture or identity can include. But here we'd like to share with you the diversity wheel from Johns Hopkins University that is meant to capture the outside of the wheel is really meant to capture aspects of one's identity that may be more likely to change over the course of a lifetime. And then the inner circle being those parts of someone's identity that tend to be a little bit more stable again throughout life. And there's many, many more, we know, than just these. But each section of the wheel really influences how individuals act, their belief systems, their values, their expectations of other people, their expectations of the world. But we know that it's so much more than skin color. And when we really start to look at these different components within, what could be culture or identity, like I said, many beyond even these topics that are mentioned here, we know that while we see differences, we can always find similarities. So we're just going to take a moment here for some reflection. And if anybody wants to put anything in the chat or unmute, you're welcome to, but you're also welcome to just take this time to kind of reflect on some questions. So our first one is, what aspects of your cultural identity do you most value or identify with, and why? In what ways has that possibly changed over time as well? Like I said, kind of thinking of the outer ring of this wheel being those things that maybe tend to change, either maybe what we value as much about our identity or what we see as being our identity, but what things do you value most? And then the second question would be, how does this influence your view of the people you work with or are committed to helping? I know that for me personally, thinking about, looking at this wheel and thinking about my own experiences, and by training, I am a school psychologist, and I would say that I do identify as a school psychologist. I don't know if that's an identity per se, but I guess how I see that is I feel like we are a field of people who try to be helpers. And so the way that I see that, obviously that's not something that was part of my identity per se when I was younger. I think there are definitely some family values that are built, that have not built into, but, have kind of created or formed my identity over time, of course. But in the work that I do, I see that identity as being something where I want to be a helper, right? I want people to be included. I believe that everybody should be treated fairly. And so there are aspects of, our organization does a lot of great things that really kind of help to further the work that we do. And so that is something that I think about when I think about how my identity has, or what I currently see as part of my identity influencing my work. So those are just some aspects, just some questions for self-reflection. Is there anything anybody wants to add? Okay. We'll keep on moving on. So another thing that we wanted to touch on as part of the session tonight is equity. And this will lead us into the rest of the components where Maria is going to take over and really kind of connect these terms of race and culture and ethnicity along with equity, and how that really applies, what really doing equity work looks like in education. So here you'll see that these are the pillars of equity that that PDE has put together. So it's beyond the scope of today's session to go into these, but I just want to read a little bit of what PDE has defined as equity in the state of Pennsylvania. So every student having access to the educational resources and rigor they need at the right moment in their education across race, gender, ethnicity, language, disability, religion, sexual orientation, gender identity, family background, and or family income. And that was adopted from the Council of Chief State School Office. So again, every student having access to the educational resources and rigor they need at the right moment. So I want you to keep that in mind as Maria moves into a discussion of culturally responsive teaching, because really in order to be doing equitable work means doing culturally responsive teaching, but she's going to break that down and show you some comparisons to better understand what that means. All right, Maria.
Thanks, Heather. Okay. I want to tell you all how much I appreciate you being engaged in this, and I'm going to ask you to continue that. And again, I want you to feel comfortable wherever you're at and whatever you're doing this evening. If it's just by listening, if it's by sharing, however you feel safe in sharing, but we want to create that environment. As a linguist myself, language is important, but being able to share in a way in the domain that best suits you and your needs right now is important. Creating that environment for you to be able to ask questions. So at any point and any time that you just need to pause me, we need to just pause on a subject. Let's do it. So the other thing is I'm going to turn my camera off because you didn't come to see me. You came to engage with the content. So let's do that. I'm going to turn my camera off, but hopefully you'll still be able to see what's on the screen here. And I really want you to take a look at this. So understanding the difference between these three. We've heard these terms, most of us, but we're not able to know the difference sometimes. So our terms are multicultural, social justice, and culturally responsive. Take a moment and look at that. And I want to know, what do you see in these definitions that is the same or different? I asked for differences, but if you find similarities, please share those. And again, I want you to feel free to share them either by unmiking or by in the chat, however you feel most comfortable. Or maybe it's just where you're at to yourself right now.
It looks like the culturally responsive is more of a thought process to me, with the
Yes.
affective and cognitive aspects.
Yes.
And the social justice is just be aware of how you treat people and how others are acting and responding.
Fantastic, Karen. And it looks like you connected exactly with what Jody was thinking as well. Perfect. Actions versus cognition, thinking process. Wonderful. Anybody else see anything that they would like to add? Yeah, so as you think of things and you want to put those in the chat, I definitely want to make sure that we capture your voice and if you want to share, but we're going to move forward. That's exactly what I wanted you to get out of this was that when we're talking about culturally responsive, although these three things are connected, they are not interchangeable and they're not independent of one another. But it's that cognitive consideration that we're talking about and that interplay of the affective component. Yeah, so you can go ahead and move forward. Thank you, Heather. So you got it. As Zaretta Hammond has pointed out, culture, it turns out, is the way that every brain makes sense of the world. So big takeaway, cultural responsiveness begins in the brain. As I pursued my advanced degrees in applied linguistics through the University of Massachusetts, Boston, really the biggest question when you enter into the School of Appling, as we call it, applied linguistics, is you are posed with the chicken or the egg kind of component in linguistics. Which comes first, culture or language, language or culture? And so you quickly understand within your studies, we're not talking about culture. If you're thinking about surface culture, we're not talking about clothes. We're not talking about the foods that we eat. We're talking about deep culture, the things that happen in the brain. So thank you, those that keep sharing, please, as I'm talking. So it's how the brain processes information is where we are going to meet today. And that's exactly what we're going to be building on. This is why everyone, regardless of whether we're talking about race or ethnicity, has a culture. Okay, so think as Zaretta says, think of culture as the software of the brain's hardware. All right, we can move on. So if anyone has taken any course in language, you may be familiar with this concept, usually presented in Language 101, is the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. If not, I'll go ahead and just fill you in quickly. This is a statement that Benjamin Whorf had put out in the early turn of the century, not this century, the last century. Language shapes the way we think and determines what we think about. I have this slide up here, but I put that forward, but I want to tell you that this has been disproven. We know that this has been disproven, even though we call this linguistic relativity. On most accounts, it's been disproven. And we know this because we know by and large, the areas of the brain that are responsible for language are separate from those in cognition. And we're going to prove that to you today. But we know that they interface. So we can say not as determinism, but rather as influencing. So one of the great examples of this, as Sapir had put forth, was the Inuit tribe in Alaska. They had noted that there were over 50 or more terms for snow. And maybe you heard this before. You've seen cute memes on it. And that's where this came from. Now, because as an American English speaker, I do not have that many terms for snow, does it mean that I do not, or you do not, have the conceptual understanding of different types of snow? Of course not. You can conceive the different types of snow. You just don't have a need, or it's not valued in your culture and in your language. You don't utilize that many. Yet in the Inuit tribes, they do. It's necessary, and it's necessary for survival. Also, let's take the word Schadenfreude. For example, this term in German, which means to take pleasure in another's unhappiness. There is no translatable equivalent in English. We don't have one. But same. It wouldn't be true to say that as an English speaker, one had never experienced or would not be able to comprehend this emotion. However, I do want to add here that there is evidence that language structures develop preconceived notions. And here's that interface. So we're not determinism, but the influencing. So there was a study that was done to look at how German and Spanish speakers viewed different objects based on their gender association. So for those of you that may not be acquainted or haven't been for quite a while since you took Spanish or German, that's obviously languages that are genderized. English is not. So the results showed that in describing things that are referred to as masculine in Spanish, speakers of that language graded them as having more quote unquote manly characteristics. These same items, which were used for feminine phrasings like in German and D, were seen by German speakers as containing effeminate characteristics. So I share all this. The core of it and the theory is that though by and large, this statement that is on your screen right now has been debunked, it makes us still question how our perceptions may shape us. So let's think on that. Next one, please. So thinking about culture in the brain and the language we use and how we process information, leveraging the brain's information processing propensities and building new connections is going to be paramount. What you see here is these 4 different types of cognitive learning tools. And I want to connect to what you're seeing on your screen here with the concepts that you may have heard of: collectivism and individualistic. So we have collective cultures and individualistic cultures. Collective cultures are usually more oral tradition, and they then would develop cognitive tools that allow these items on your screen, these learning tools, to thrive by the way that they transmit information. So, memory, the first picture to your left, those funds of knowledge. The second one, puzzle and patterns. Talk about wordplay, perspectives, multiple perspectives. Leveraging information and making meaning of it in order to capitalize and sustain this. Leveraging those neuro pathways. It's all in how we tell stories. As Ruby Payne talks about those using the metaphors, and as Lisa Delpit talks about, it's teaching those hidden rules that we convey. So if we go to the next screen, we're going to connect this to then when we're talking about storytelling and the collective cultures versus the individualistic cultures. I want to add on to that direct versus indirect. So sometimes we're talking about communication styles in different cultures. You may be familiar if you look at this graphic on your screen. You see low context versus high context. So low context communication aspires to get straight to the point. Many low context cultures are individualistic, which I'm from. And if you identify as, from American or North American culture, it would be an individualistic. So people openly express their views and tend to make important information obvious to others. In high context cultures, such as those found in Latin America, Asia, Africa, the physical context of the message carries a great deal of importance. People tend to be more indirect and to expect people that are communicating with them to read between the lines, to decode the implicit parts of their messages. So high context cultures are very often collectivism. Furthermore, we could consider in linguistic terms the register or the level of formality in language that's determined by the context in which it is spoken or written. I will go back to Lisa Delpit with in her Other People's Children. She talks about, and this always has stuck with me in the academic setting, they talk about that most women that identify as middle class white would American would make a request of students to shut the door by saying, how would you say that? If this is an identification of yours, or even I always say the mother in me. How do we usually make the request of students to shut the door? Normally, I would say, would you please go shut the door?
Please shut the door.
Yep. Please shut the door. Which to many cultures sounds like it's an option. Putting that please there. So there's ambiguity. What I really mean is shut the door. And Delpit points out in African-American culture, for example, a woman might say, go shut the door. It's direct. And in some cultures, that is absolutely how I would convey that meaning, to be able to be more clear and more direct. So let's connect this again to our different modes of storytelling. On the one side of the screen, you see a North American type, where some of us are very familiar if you come from an ELA background. And then on the other side of the screen, you see the Greek tragedy. And we think about how stories are told, indirectly or directly. The story structure focuses here on plot in our culture. Beginning, middle, end, we have the climax. And it weaves sequence and cause and effect, characters and consequences into the plot. But someone that's coming from a different culture, the cognitive research indicates that, again, back to those components, those 4 components that we talked about. If we're not leveraging those tools that our students that are bringing to the table, consequently, we may not be allowing them access to those story structures. We would need to be explicit in order for them to access the information. So it goes far beyond vocabulary, sentence structure. All right, next one. So the question really is, how will you open up your academic space to leverage the cultural funds of knowledge and cognitive tools each student brings to the table? And so we want to think about that again in the context of the arrival, and thinking about that, how does this book connect to cultural responsive teaching and learning? Did we have another part of the video that we wanted to share, Heather? Or no, we wanted to end there.
Yeah, we were going to have people go into breakout rooms.
Yep.
And discuss how they think, starting with, we know that part of the part of this book study has been to bring.
Identity. But when we're talking about being culturally responsive, really thinking about how our students, what they're bringing to the table, not only with their full linguistic repertoire, but also, as we talked about, those cognitive tools that are transmitted and cultivated through the way we communicate in the communities in which we live. And so not seeing those differences as deficits, but in fact, assets. So we need to be able to realize that and capitalize on that through the types of literature that we provide. So the structures, the types. And so those are the things the questions we need to ask. Who wrote the book? And where was the book written? So these are these questions that you're typically used to asking when you look at stories. Looking at the story structure, you saw The Arrival. There was no text, but how could you then leverage that for students that are from various language groups and cultures in your classroom?
One thing that I noticed about the book, The Arrival, is for me personally, I teach in a co-taught model with autistic support students. And I do have some students who, yes, they're verbal, but they are non-readers. And for them to be able to participate in a book study or a book walk with a text, a piece of literature that everyone is using, it's the same text and they're all doing the same work. I think that would be extremely beneficial to all of them because they all have a voice.
Question for you, Karen and group. Do you feel that in using a text like this would, I want to make sure that I'm, let me say, would it minimize our strides in, if you were in the earlier stages of acquiring literacy? Would, does anybody have any thoughts on that? And then, you know, we have our two sides. So we have our teaching to read and then reading to learn, or learning to read and reading to learn, right? So I don't know who's represented here, and if we want to hear from different voices on, you know, elementary, or if we have any secondary folks, or like, we should thank you for sharing about autistic support. Any other perspectives on this?
Well, I can think of one student in particular who is very, and he had a, we're on the second day of PSSAs. First time he's taking the test, and he had a really, really difficult time and was saying, you know, I'm dumb, I'm stupid, I can't read, but yet he has the most amazing ideas and conversations, and he is so witty, and he can pick up on such subtleties in conversation. And I think he would do amazing with this book, because he heard somebody talking and he knew there was an incident at lunch, and he knew that it had to do with something about him, and it really, really bothered him. But I think in something like this, he would be able to share if he was willing to. I mean, like, he doesn't share a whole lot, but if everybody was having to do the same thing and share what they're saying, they have nothing other than the pictures to rely on. So those students who he listens to reading all the time, they're all on the same level. So I think for him, it would be amazing.
That's such great insight. Thank you, Karen. Anybody else? Jody?
Yeah, I was just going to piggyback with what you said and what Karen had said. Her autistic support classroom, they have reading as a barrier often, and that is very similar. I'm a reading specialist, elementary, kindergarten through 5th grade. And we have a knowledge building curriculum, and we often do things like this, and we serve a very diverse population. 30% of our schools are ELs, 80% come from poverty, and just being able to use their oral language as a way to build relationships and discuss the world around us, and to have that mindset of being, thinking and talking and verbalizing. But then as children do become readers, then they're able to read texts and then pull meaning from the text. And I just want to say this whole PLC has really helped me. I did a whole campaign because I get the privilege of spending Title I money at my school. So I did a whole professional development for our staff on the concept of like mirrors, windows, and sliding glass doors. And I was able to purchase books celebrating different cultures, really being inclusive of everything, all of the things on that wheel. I tried really hard. And I gave them classroom books and said, now this isn't for like Black History Month, you put these books out or whatever. This is for all the time, because the kids should see themselves represented. And I was very strategic, and because I noticed I attended over the years, because I value all the social justice and I see literacy as a form of advocating for social justice. But I was buying a lot of books that promoted like understanding the history. And then I transitioned, and I spent a lot of the money buying books that were just positive and showing people from different cultures and races that wasn't attached to any of the political stuff, any of the struggles. It was all just, they happened to be children of color that were great at whatever. And it has been well received. And I see the books in the hands of kids, and this PLC has really helped me to refine how I think about that. So I just wanted to say thank you for that. But it made me think about all of that.
Thank you so much for sharing, Jody. And the one thing that I really wanted to also pick up on what you just said was, remembering that language is 4 domains. And you really highlighted a very important thing, especially if we think about all of our students in language acquisition. And reading doesn't stand alone. We need to capitalize on the oral domain. And so for you all to be pulling that out and understanding that listening and speaking component, and allowing the student to bring to highlight what they're bringing to the table, to capitalize on that, to support their literacy, their writing and reading. That is so essential. We know based on research that is going to lead to the biggest gains, the greatest outcomes. So I'm so glad that you highlighted that, and thank you for sharing that feedback, and thank you for the work that you're doing as a teacher.
Absolutely. And I just kind of wanted to add to that too. Like when I, first look at the differences between multicultural social justice and culturally responsive, I'm hearing you, Jody, in the application of what you're doing, getting to that culturally responsive piece, right? You're not just saying like, okay, here's books. And like you said, they're to be used beyond like whatever month might be celebrating a certain topic, that they are really integrated, and then making sure that, that students are being challenged, right? Because I think that going back, I think about that equity definition where we're looking at rigor too. Yes, we need students to feel safe, and that's the affective part of culturally responsive. So seeing themselves in books, right, is an aspect of feeling safe, but also making sure that we are appropriately challenging them and not minimizing what they do bring to the table, potentially cognitively, because of language differences or language challenges. So I just wanted to point that out. I really heard that in what you were explaining about your school and your classroom.
So I would like to just push on this group a little more, and if others would like to share. And I'm thinking about those cognitive learning tools when we're talking about culturally responsive. And for those of you that do have classroom library, or just as Jody had shared and Karen has shared, is responsible for choosing books. I wonder for all of us tonight is looking at your text. How is this, or the books that you have, how does this change the way that you're going to look at the books that you have and the choices you make, and teaching literacy when we're thinking about leveraging the memory component, those funds of knowledge, or puzzles being highly valued in many other cultures. What was our other one was perspectives, differing perspectives, hearing different sides. And then lastly, that other one was what was my last one? The talk and wordplay. In many other cultures, sharing stories, storytelling orally, there's a lot of wordplay in that. So anybody want to share, or maybe you've already thought about this and share your experience in how you go about choosing books?
Well, since it's dead silence again. um, so I grew up on the West Coast. And I tell all my students this every year. Language is really strange. I have I've taught fourth grade, I've taught different grades. We were going to go on a field trip, and I came out when I was in Pennsylvania, and I said, okay, we were going to Silver Lake, which is a park area. And I said, okay, make sure you wear your tennis shoes. And the kids were like, we're playing tennis. I thought we were going to the park. On the West Coast, sneakers, whatever, are all tennis shoes. They're all those sneaker type things. And I'm like, well, yeah, you're going to wear your tennis shoes, but they're not, I don't have any shoes for tennis. So even within an area, within the states, there are nuances in our language.
Mm-hmm.
And, even in areas, soda and pop, there's that difference. I think even within a region, we can say different things. And we have our kids need to realize that when they say something, that just because the other person looks at them kind of strange, it doesn't mean that they're mad at them. They may not understand what they actually said the first time, and putting that into, again, perspective, and using tone of voice as well, and making that an everyday thing, and not immediately that they're angry at them, or to hit them, or using all of those points of view.
Yeah, I love that you pointed out those dialectic differences, and using that to teach students about differences and how to respond to those differences. There's some really fun things if you ever look at some dialectical fun maps. Harvard University put one out, New York Times did a piece on it, but they're always fun. And yeah, those are great. And I think to go off of what you're saying, one of the pivotal moments in my studies was in a forensic linguistics class. And the most important thing I've learned about language was language does two things. It conceals and it conveys. Doesn't matter what language you're in. And it's very purposeful.
Yes.
And so, we do that out of survival, and you pick that up. You using tennis shoes. It tells me where you're from. And it also will tell you who's not from where you're from. We do that in street names and in town names. We still, there's a Hebrew word shofar. That's where that comes from. That we do that to be able to know who's with us and who's not, who's a part of us and who's not. But we need to be aware of that and be able to be able to talk about that and let people in to those spaces. And it's so important. And I want to connect that to what Jody was saying with the book she'd shared about using fairy tales. And so again, in cultures, we tell our stories to preserve the things that we're transmitting. But being able to find the way that we do that, fairy tales is a great way that is transmittable through various cultures. I love that you shared that with us. So thank you. Anybody else? Yeah, fairy tales doesn't always fit that classic pattern, does it? Of the story plot diagram, depending on what type. Yeah, sometimes if you look at Aesop fables even and things like that.
Well,
Mhm.
and they even, I would often, I used to do it with like Cinderella from like 8 different countries, and I loved that. Most recently I did the gingerbread man around
Yeah.
Christmas time, because you don't want to do the whole like, stereotypical thing. So I was like, so we actually learned, we like ate gingerbread cookies, and we learned these different, it was really, really great.
Yeah.
And it's just a
Yeah.
fun and non-threatening way to like connect with each other.
I think that's fantastic. And if any of you have other strategies or tools that you've used, I know I've used storyboarding before, even just to get the concept beginning, middle, and end, but allowing students to make it their own and bring what they have again to the table, starting out with that oral component. How do they tell the story? And really listening to them and allowing them to bring their stories in. One of the greatest things that we talk about, I obviously am an ELD specialist by trade. I'm also an ELA teacher, but having them talk about the stories from when they were really little. Everybody can talk about that. Tell us about the stories that you remember. Tell me, when you dream, what language do you dream in? And can you share us some of those words or thoughts or phrases that come to mind? And there is such beauty in being able to bring that. And I see someone talked about the vocabulary just from a Brit. There's different ways to say things. And even in the different ways to say things, you go, I don't have that. I don't have that. I don't have that way of expressing it. I love how you were able to capture that in a phrase or a turn of phrase or words. And then we as a class can then be broadening our repertoire together, that it's not just one student or that student's different or they have a different, no, we all are learning this together, being able to tell stories together in different ways. In language, we call that translanguaging, being able to bring all of our languages to the table to tell, to convey our meaning. But there's many different ways. Does anybody have any other strategies or tools they use?
One strategy I use is acknowledging and allowing students to use whatever language or voice they're most comfortable with. So in the beginning of the year, we do what's called a My Name vignette. We study Sandra Cisneros' house on Mango Street, and we take her My Name vignette from it. The students do interviews at home and research on the origin of their names and the stories that go with their names. But every year I'll have a student who will choose to write their story in Arabic, or somebody will want to write their story in Spanish. And so, I think accepting that, posting it with everyone else's work and having that be just as legitimate. I mean, I can do Google Translate with it and figure out what the student is saying, rather than having them do Google Translate.
That's an excellent.
awesome.
Thank you for bringing that book up. That's an excellent one. Many times, if you are an ELD teacher or work with students that are multilingual learners, that is definitely a book that many are familiar with. And Catherine, thank you for bringing that up. And we want to add that to the Padlet and share. There are many others like that. Yeah, that's great. That's an excellent example.
I'm also just going to drop into the chat 2 books, you're probably aware of them, but in case you're not, that talk a little bit more about a culturally responsive model. Maria was talking a little bit before about the surface, shallow, and deep. So I'm just going to put those One is Culturally Responsive Teaching in the Brain by Zaretta Hammond, and then Culturally Responsive Teaching for Multilingual Learners. That's by Snyder and Senfener.
Wow, it's 7:30 already. Oh my goodness. What fun this was. I hope the rest of you are having fun or learned something. We learned together. This was great.
Yeah, thank you for sharing all that you're doing in your classrooms. Jody and Karen, especially for chiming in, those of you for being here. You know, we hope that you learned something new or took away some ideas from tonight.